Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live, folks. Good to be with you again on this Monday morning. Obviously, I don't know, for me, it's a somber Monday after the events of last night for sure. And on that note, I did want to just quickly raise up something that people can support right now. Hang on. So folks will know we had a conversation a few weeks ago with Hala from the Samir Project, and they are doing an urgent request for support after the airstrike last night at Al Aqsa Hospital that left at least 4 dead. Folks saw the videos of literally people burning alive, right? And obviously it was totally horrifying, but they do amazing work, giving direct aid in Gaza in both the north and the south, and it is their south campaign that they're using for emergency response funding. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. It is also in the show description. So I just wanted to start with that because I think in after seeing things like that everybody kind of wants to know, like, what can they do. And obviously I think the most important thing for us to do is to keep organizing, to keep trying to stop the flow of arms to Israel, but certainly giving direct aid to families who have directly witnessed, had people killed in those kind of horrors, is an opportunity that I think that we should take. And so I contributed to that. I hope others will as well. And definitely follow the Samir Project on whatever social media that you use. They're on Instagram and X, Twitter. I don't want to say X. All right. So I know people are really excited about this conversation too, interested in this conversation, and I am as well. Really honored to be able to host our guest today. Take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel while you're here, and of course, share it with other folks because there's still a lot of people who don't know the truth about October 7th. We hear propaganda and lies promoted about it every day. And so it's important to get these conversations out to people so that they can hear what actually occurred, what didn't occur, and what we don't know, right? Because we don't know everything either. So our guest, Asa Winstanley, has been writing about Palestine and the Israel lobby since 2005. He spent 2 years living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank as an activist and writer. He has been an associate editor and reporter with the award-winning website, The Electronic Intifada, which also for more than a decade, which also I just to say, like, as just shout out to all of the work that the Electronic Intifada has been doing for decades now, but also specifically the live streams and all of the reporting that they have done since October 7th. Just amazing work. Asa is the author of Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Brought Down Jeremy Corbyn, which you can buy now on OR Books. And the subject of this conversation today, obviously, is his most recent article, unless he's published one since then, but an article he published on October 7th, 2024. So 1 year out after Al-Aqsa flood on October 7th of 2023. And it's titled How Israel Killed Hundreds of Its Own People on 7 October. So without further ado, Asa, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's an honor to be with you. Very appreciative of all the work that you and your colleagues do.
Thank you, Jared. It's great to be with you, and it's an honor to be on your esteemed podcast, live, no less.
Thank you, man. Appreciate that. So let's just get into this piece. So it covers a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there, kind of looks at where these things come from. This is reporting that you've been doing along the way. So this is really a culmination of a year's worth of reporting and articles that you've been putting out. And I think we should just start with some basic general questions to orient ourselves and the audience to this discussion, which is, what do you think is important for everyone to understand about the aims and objectives of October 7th or Al-Aqsa flood for the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and how they sought to achieve those aims and objectives.
Well, I'd say the number one thing for people to understand about Al-Aqsa Flood was that it was a military offensive. It was a military offensive with primarily with military targets, namely the military bases that have been besieging Gaza for decades, not just since 2007, but really since 1948, since the Gaza Strip became the Gaza Strip. And, this is a point the dissident Israeli historian Ilan Pappé makes, is that the Gaza Strip was a creation of Israel. There was, of course, Gaza is an ancient city, and the Gaza region within the so-called British Mandate of Palestine, essentially the British colony of Palestine. There was a Gaza region, but it was a larger region, and the military bases and the settlements as well surrounding the Gaza Strip have been besieging the Gaza Strip since then, since the Palestinians were kicked out of their homes in what is now considered to be present-day Israel, beyond the boundary line with the Gaza Strip. And so the goal of the Palestinian resistance was a military one. It was to it was political and it was military. So there was the wider context where they were trying to bring the Palestinian cause back into the world's attention after it being neglected and sidelined for so long, and with the US empire and with the government of Netanyahu and their allies in the West thinking that the Palestinians, the plight of the Palestinian refugees, still refugees 76 years later, has been sidelined by making these shady deals with Gulf tyrannies like Bahrain, the UAE, and what was looking likely to be Saudi Arabia before Al-Aqsa Flood. But there was also an immediate military goal. And this is really I really tried to bring this out in the piece concretely, because it was, by any objective military standard, the military goals of the Al-Aqsa Flood operation were a stunning success. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Like, it's one, I'm not a military expert, but it seems to me that it was really the greatest act of guerrilla warfare possibly in history, because they destroyed every single military base surrounding the Gaza Strip. All the soldiers were either killed, all the Israeli soldiers were either killed or captured and taken back to Gaza. Most of them are still there now, right? Because there was 255 Israeli prisoners of war and detainees who were taken into the Gaza Strip by the Palestinian resistance on October 7th, 2023. Around about 100 of them are still said to be in the Gaza Strip. How many of them are still alive is unknown. Probably around half of them, or less than half of them, are still alive. Due to Israeli bombardments, by the way. This is another aspect of what happened. But it was a stunning military success. It was the first time in history that Palestinian fighters have been able to regain territory since it was lost. Territory in Palestine that was lost in what Palestinians call the Nakba of 1947 to 1949, where the majority of Palestinians were driven out of their homeland by the Zionist militias, which conquered Palestine with the collusion of the British Empire. And so, that's essentially it. What most people don't seem to, what most Westerners don't seem to know or to realize about Palestinian resistance, in the same way that they don't seem to realize about the Lebanese resistance, is that the targets of the Palestinian Lebanese resistance are overwhelmingly military. That is just a fact. Like, that's not an ideological statement. It's just a fact. Like, and the Western media goes out of their way to cover this up, and they really collude with the Israeli government to cover this up. I mean, we've seen a really sickening example, yet the latest sickening example of this today in the Western media, with in the British TV channel Sky News, owned by Rupert Murdoch, of course, put out this disgusting article and headline, and in their live coverage as well. They were covering the as this live is going on. I'm sure most of the reviewers will all be seeing on social media the horrific scenes coming out of central Gaza, Deir al-Balah, the central region of Gaza, where Israel has once again bombed refugee tents of Palestinians who had been displaced in this war time and time again. 90% of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been displaced from their homes since 7th of October 2023. And they're bombing the tents, and we're seeing these graphic images of Palestinians being literally burned to death in an Israeli Holocaust on the Gaza Strip. And while that's happening, the British Sky News is saying their sympathy is with the killers, is with the Israeli army killers, who the Lebanese resistance last night targeted with a drone strike on a military base, military target. That's who they're targeting. That's who they successfully hit last night. And at least 4 Israeli soldiers that Israel has admitted to, and many dozens of others were injured. At least 4 were killed. And the sympathy of Sky News is with them, with those killers who were killed in a legitimate military strike by the Lebanese resistance. So the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance are carrying out strikes and military offensives overwhelmingly on military targets. Now, that's not to say that none of the captives taken on the 7th of October were non-combatants. I'm not saying that. I do get into that into the article, but in the article. And that's why I make the distinction between prisoners of war, soldiers, and detainees. But nonetheless, I think that's really the main thing that I wanted to get across in the article, that there was this objective military goal, which was overwhelmingly successful on the 7th of October. There's no doubt about that. And really, the media propaganda that we've seen about, the disinformation about alleged Palestinian atrocities, which I'm sure we'll get into, and the bigger issue of the Hannibal directive, which I know we're going to talk about, both of those things were really a way for Israel and its allies to really distract from and cover up its military defeat, because Israel sells itself to the Western imperialist powers, to the United States and its proxies, essentially, as this useful regional proxy, as this useful state in the region which can uphold US military hegemony, intelligence hegemony and so forth. Well, that was shattered on the 7th of October by their defeat, which was not only a military defeat but an intelligence defeat. It was an unprecedented intelligence defeat by the Palestinian resistance, that they had kept the reality of this offensive really a secret from the Israelis, effectively a secret, using really sophisticated techniques. And also they uprooted the Israeli spy networks in Gaza over the last few years by executing collaborators in the Gaza Strip. That very much happened. And those defeats were so huge that Israel, to really distract from that, has tried to redress that defeat by changing the subject, by distracting from it, by carrying out a genocide, and trying to demonstrate what they see as their military might. And we saw this with the recent Iranian strikes, the Iranian military strikes on the Israeli military base, Israeli Air Force base, the Nevatim Air Force base in the south of occupied Palestine. And we saw on Israeli and pro-Israeli propagandists sort of mocking it and saying, you didn't kill anyone. That's the whole point. The whole point of the Iranian intervention is to stop the weapons of war. It was not to randomly shell Israeli non-combatants. The idea was to stop the genocide, and by any objective measure, it did make a strike in that direction by hitting military targets. So a guerrilla warfare operation, a commando operation, a people's resistance like the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance, the goals are going to be to stop the genocide, and not just the genocide of the last year, the long, slow genocide. Again, Ilan Pape said this years ago, that there was a slow-moving genocide being carried out against the Palestinians. And he, a lot of people at the time said he was going too far. A lot of people, even in the Western solidarity movement, said he was going too far. But we can see absolutely now how right he was, because now the slow-moving genocide has become an active, fast-moving genocide.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. And I think the one question I would sort of follow up on that with is, um, so obviously they took prisoners of war and they did take detainees, and they had a military goal associated with that. And there's a history of those, of prisoner exchanges. And you write about that in the piece, and you write about how the level of success of October 7th, that that I mean, I can't remember the exact quote from the piece, but there's somewhere in it where you sort of say this actually challenged it sort of in some ways, maybe Israel felt that it had to go, really full bore on kind of a propaganda narrative because it was so successful that they couldn't really deal or reckon with the consequences of having to do an exchange that would have emptied the Palestinian prisons or something like that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing and putting words in your mouth, but
Yeah,
say a
that's
little
right.
bit about that in terms of uh, why you think the propaganda became so necessary and widespread.
Well, if you look at previous prisoner exchanges, and I detail them in the article, so there was really two main ones, which was the one in 2011, which was for a single Israeli soldier who was captured in 2006. Gilad Shalit, of course, I've hesitated to name him in previous pieces, but I decided to in this one. And that's because the reason I hesitated was because, of course, he was for years. If people remember those years, he was in the same way as Sky News is trying to do today by sort of humanizing the killers, the Israeli soldiers the legitimate military targets who were successfully targeted by the Lebanese resistance last night. There was for many years there was a lot of fuss in the Western press about Gilad Shalit. Oh, Gilad Shalit, kidnapped by Hamas terrorists and all this kind of nonsense. But that was a successful military operation where this occupation soldier illegally occupying the Gaza Strip, and the Gaza Strip was still occupied despite the 2005 evacuation from the within the occupied interior of the Gaza Strip. Nonetheless, this soldier was carrying out military operations against the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. He was successfully captured by the Palestinian resistance in 2006. He was treated very well. Some years after he was released, actually, there was quite a funny video of him having a nice time with his captors in the Gaza Strip, and they were treating him to barbecue, barbecued meats and so forth. He was treated very well. And he was released for 1,024 prisoners. I'll never forget the number. 1,024 Palestinian prisoners. And crucially, one of those men and women was Yahya Sinwar himself, who now is, of course, the leader of Hamas, and is claimed by the Israelis to have been the so-called mastermind of October 7th. Whether that's true or not, there's no doubt he's a significant leader within the Palestinian resistance movement. And there was a similar exchange in 2008 with the Lebanese resistance. Less Lebanese and Palestinians fighters, prisoners, fighters and civilians, former fighters and civilians. Less of them were released, but the price was for 3 bodies of Israeli soldiers. I believe it was 3. There were bodies of dead Israeli soldiers who'd been captured. And so, like you said, the Israeli planners, especially Israeli politicians, saw this as sort of a humiliating defeat and a compromise with their enemies that was a compromise too far. And if you looked at the number of prisoners that were taken, successfully taken captive on the 7th of October by the Palestinian resistance, even let's say leave aside the detainees, I don't have the breakdown for the number that were soldiers and the number that were detainees, but I remembered at the time when while it was still happening, doing a sort of back of the envelope calculation, and it would have been just the soldiers alone, exchanging them for Palestinian prisoners would have been enough, in theory, to empty the entire Israeli jails. The whole of the jail system, in theory, could have been emptied using the precedent of 1,024 prisoners, 1,024 Palestinians for one Israeli. So, this was seen, the exchanges were seen as a form of weakness by Israeli planners and Israeli politicians especially. And so they decided to it seems, we're not privy to their internal conversations, but it seems that they decided they weren't going to do that anymore, and that they would start using the Hannibal directive, which is this secretive Israeli military doctrine, which was established in 1986. And it says that, in a nutshell, that if Israeli troops are captured, you can kill them instead of letting them be taken captive. You should bomb and shoot the places where they've been captured, where while the capture is happening, you can bomb the whole area, even at the cost of killing the Israeli captives themselves. So it was a military doctrine which was established in secret, but it came to light, and I detail all this in the piece. It really came to light after 2014, where there was a Hannibal strike against the Israeli soldier named Hadar Goldin, who'd been captured in the Gaza Strip in the course of another Israeli military assault. They bombed and annihilated the whole area. They killed up to about 200 Palestinian civilians, including 75 children. And in the course of that, they managed to kill this soldier. Well, for one reason or another, that led to the Hannibal directive being exposed is probably too strong a word, but it was talked about in the Israeli media, because in that actual strike, it was in Rafah, in the south of the Gaza Strip. The order apparently, reportedly, was given over the radio, Hannibal, Hannibal. And Max Blumenthal talks about this in his book on the 2014 Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. I believe it's called The 51-Day War. Excellent book. So that really led to the Hannibal directive being talked about more and really being exposed to the public, although it was rarely talked about in the West.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that. I mean, it's not amusing, but like I remember the first times I started hearing this talked about, and it does sound like one of those like this can't be kind of real sort of things. And then I was watching. Abdul Jawad actually told me to watch Fauda at some point, and I watch it, and they're just talking about it. I mean, like so this is for folks who don't know, this is a mainstream sort of propaganda, kind of pro.
Isn't it like the sort of Israeli 24? I've never watched it.
Yeah, I mean, so there's supposed to be an Arabized unit of the Israeli. I don't know whether it's, I guess, Shin Bet or whatever, like secret police kind of. And they one of them gets captured, right? And there's a whole interrogation of everybody who was there of why didn't you issue the Hannibal directive? The Hannibal directive applies in all cases of Israelis being captured by the enemy. And so this is like you say, it's like something akin to the Israeli 24. So it's like a very prominent mainstream Israeli television show, and they're having an open conversation where it's accepted within at least the confines of this fictionalized atmosphere that that this is what you do when one of your you know fellow men in arms is captured by the enemy. And so that was kind of eye-opening to me, because I was like, that means that this is, whether it's officially recognized or whatever, like it is very widespreadly known and discussed within Israeli society, such that they would actually put it on, primetime TV show kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't watched Fauda because for obvious reasons, but that
Yeah, it's
sounds
terrible.
interesting. um,
um
but that's interesting to hear that they're mentioning it in that. And yeah, it within Israeli society is it's an open secret because of course Israel is a very highly militarized society. A lot of people go into the military. Although conscription is not really as compulsory as is sometimes claimed, a lot of people, certainly before the 7th of October last year, did do escape military service, the so-called conscription, in practice, not for ideological reasons, but just because they want to have quote unquote normal lives and, go off backpacking in India or wherever else they're annoying people abroad. They they don't want to go into the Israeli military. A lot of Israelis. We did an interview with another dissident Israeli, Shir Hever, a few years ago, and he talked about this. It's quite fascinating, actually. The last numbers that we have from the Israeli military on this, that a long time ago, they come from, I believe he said 2009, 2010, and I think it was something like as few as 40 odd percent of Israelis who actually conscript into the Israeli military. And you can just, like, there is a very few number of Israelis who, on ideological reasons refuse to join the military and who are imprisoned for a few days or whatever. But they're a really small minority. Most of people who don't want to go into the military just escape it. They can just get like a psychologist assessment and just say, I'm depressed or I have whatever psychological reasons I can't be in the military, and they can escape conscription that way. Anyway, this is a bit of a divergence to say that nonetheless, Israeli society is very highly militarized, and even if it is a relatively is not as big number as is often said, nonetheless, it is a very large percentage of Israeli society which is in the military, in the army, and in other branches of the military, including the Air Force. And so, of course, the Hannibal directive is quite an open secret within Israeli society. And one of the things that I reported on some months ago, and I get into in this piece, is there is an Israeli Air Force colonel whose name is Nof Erez, who actually said on a Hebrew language podcast, Haaretz podcast actually, but only in Hebrew. He said, described the 7th of October as a mass Hannibal. That was his words. And one of the interesting things he said in that was, we trained for 20 years in Hannibal. So if you look at what happened, look at the details of what happened on the 7th of October from the Israeli military side, there was an order that came down from the top, but it didn't start from the top, actually. It started from the Israeli combatants who were in the air around the Gaza Strip within less than an hour, within minutes, really. There was drone operators, there was attack helicopters, and there was various bomber pilots, F-16s, F-35s, were all in the area, and they all began bombing everything between the Gaza Strip and between the settlements and the military bases. Anything that moved in the area was a target, and that included the Israeli captives who were on their way to Gaza. And we know that for a fact from Israeli media accounts and from video evidence and other evidence. But it was initially, there was an order that came down, and maybe we can get into the details of that, but initially it seems to have been the initiative of fighters in the Gaza division, of helicopter pilots and so forth, drone operators, because they trained in Hannibal for so long. The very first account, the very first explicit Hannibal order that we know of so far, I believe, was at I can look it up. I've got my article here. It was actually at the Erez crossing, which is in the north of the Gaza Strip. You know, it's a military checkpoint, which um, which it was a major target of the Palestinian resistance offensive on the 7th of October. It was essentially taken over. It was the military, the Israeli military base there was completely overrun. The soldiers were all killed or captured, and the remaining soldiers were so besieged that they actually, it seems that they or someone nearby there, I mean, according to the accounts in the Israeli press, they called a Hannibal strike in on themselves or in on their compatriots. It's not entirely clear who it was, but there was a Haaretz article from July which states that that decision was made at 7:18 a.m. So that's less than an hour. With the Palestinian offensive started at precisely 6:26 a.m. according to another Israeli paper, Ynet, and according to all, you can see all the evidence of that in the videos and all the reporting and so forth on the day. 6:26 a.m. So less than an hour in, there was a call for quote Hannibal at Erez. So that was the order that was issued. So it's happened very, very early. It happened explicitly, and the fighters on the ground and in the air, the Israeli fighters on the ground and in the air, kind of knew what to do straight away. Once they realized people are being captured, they started to kill them. And as far as we know, this is the first time this has ever happened to Israeli non-combatants rather than soldiers who are being captured.
Yeah, it seems like and we'll get into that, I know, a little bit more, but that seems like kind of the important distinction, I guess, in some ways between what happened on October 7th and prior, uses of Hannibal. Um, but let's talk a little bit about, some of the forms. So we've had such a widespread propaganda campaign, and, I admit my own faults in this in some ways, even in our coverage, is that I kind of didn't think people would believe this stuff. Like I kind of didn't think that a lot of the sort of atrocity propaganda that we saw, coming out very quickly was believable. And it seemed to me that by spreading this, that both the Western media and our governments were really kind of delegitimizing themselves, because it didn't seem to me that, you know, regular people would believe some of these stories. But unfortunately, I think, if you say it loud enough and you say it enough times, people do. So, at one, I just want to thank you all at Electronic Intifada, because you were onto it very early on that this was going to be a problem, and you bit by bit with each story, that was going on, you worked to research them, to see where these claims were coming from, to debunk the things that were clearly false, and to, try to, yeah, kind of get to the root of the sourcing and what was going on, where these stories come from, and so on. And so obviously we have the still occasionally repeated discussion of beheaded babies. That one probably stuck the least of all of them, although it still gets trotted out, especially by, kind of ardent Zionists, I find.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have obviously the ongoing discussion of either mass rape or rape as this kind of widespread weapon of war that was going on against civilians. And this very common notion that Hamas and the other resistance factions were targeting civilians. That's probably in many ways kind of the one that I think has stuck the most of all of them, is this notion that it was a terroristic attack that was aimed at the Israeli population and civilians in particular. Um, and so, again, you deal with all of these narratives in some detail in the article. Perhaps you could spend some time just talking about, like, where did these narratives come from, and what, if any, evidence there is of these claims, or that contradicts these claims.
Yeah, it has been fairly effective. I think the Israeli propaganda in some ways. In other ways, it has fallen apart quite spectacularly. What's quite interesting is that the mass rape claim, it's technically it's fallen apart. Like it's really it's disappeared, but it's still there as part of the ambience, let's say. So the specificities of it are dropped, silently dropped, while there is still generalized claims, especially on the anniversary, a few days last week of 7th of October attacks. Lots of Western politicians claimed that there was rapes or at least sexual assault, or the new phrase that they're using, which is quite interesting, is gender based violence, which is a much broader terminology, which really gets stretched to ridiculous proportions in some instances, including in the UN report that I cite in this piece. So there's lots of examples of that, but then one thing that I found quite interesting, one of the pieces of research I did for this article was to watch this recent Israeli film. I mean, I would call it a propaganda film. The director is a former Israeli soldier. He's quite possibly still a reservist. He took part in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. His name escapes me, but I don't really care. But I did I did the research on him as an individual, and those are the facts about him. But certainly, I mean, the film is called "We Will Dance Again." It was shown on the BBC in Britain. I believe it's available on Paramount Plus in the United States. It was a very high-profile film, and it was specifically about the supernova trance music rave that was taking place on the night of the 6th of October and into the early hours of the 7th of October. And I detail in the article how what a lot of people don't realize is that the location of a rave was actually a secret. It was a secret location for whatever reason. It's not entirely clear to me why it was secret, because it wasn't an illegal rave. It was coordinated with the Israelis. It may just be part of the kind of ambiance of these kind of trance raves where, in Europe, a lot of them used to be illegal, and so they would be secret. So maybe they're just carrying on that. So anyway, for whatever reasons, it was a secret location. So there was no way Hamas would have been able to know about it, and it certainly wasn't a target of their offensive. But it just so happened, or maybe it wasn't such a coincidence, that it was essentially in the path between the Gaza Strip and the military bases. It was taking place in the fields right near the Re'im military base, which is the regional headquarters of the Gaza division. And I get into the detail in the article, accounts from senior Israeli military sources, based on the reporting of very pro-Israel, very pro-military Israeli journalists, Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zeytun. Ronan Bergman, who's also a New York Times journalist, who has all his sources are in the Israeli military, Shin Bet and Mossad. He's very pro all those genocidal institutions. And in one of his most important articles from the beginning of this year, according to his sources, the Gaza division was overwhelmed. It was overrun. The Gaza division was overrun. So that, what I was saying in the beginning about the military success of the Palestinian resistance offensive on the 7th of October is not my opinion. It's the opinion of the opponents of the Palestinian resistance, namely the Israeli military. Right, I'm getting a bit off tangent here, but my point is that in this film about the supernova rave, one of the things that is very, very striking to me as a reporter who's been covering all these disinformation that you talk about, and that my colleagues at the Electronic Intifada have really reported on even more than me. Like my colleague Ali Abu Nama has really done the most work on debunking the mass rapes narrative, which is completely untrue. It's a complete lie. It never happened. There is just a reminder to people that it may still be. Sorry, actually, I'll finish my thought and then I'll come back to that. What I was about to say was, what is quite striking about that film is that this mass rapes narrative, this disinformation narrative, has completely disappeared. It's not mentioned in that film. It's barely mentioned. There's two people who say, one of them's a woman who was at the rave who says she was afraid she was going to be raped, but there's nothing concrete. And then there's a man who says he's afraid someone else could have been raped, but there's no concrete. They're just talking about their fears. So in the last year, though, was what we saw was, especially from the New York Times, disinformation from the New York Times, other Western media, was all these claims by supposed eyewitnesses, people like Rami Davidian, people like Raz Cohen, who claimed to have seen, in the case of Raz Cohen, he claimed to have seen women being raped. And he had at the Supernova site, and he had all these graphic accounts of, I'm not even going to say what he said because it was quite outlandish, quite graphic. But his story kept changing between the Western media that he was talking to. He's disappeared now. You don't see him on the media anymore. He's not in this film. We will dance again. Quite strikingly, he's not in the film. And his claims were really what informed his line about Screams Without Words. Was what informed the New York Times' most notorious headline in Screams Without Words, that these supposed victims of sexual assault, Israeli victims of sexual assault at the Supernova rave, all of this has disappeared. All of it has collapsed. There's no evidence for it, and still today, there is still not a single named or even unnamed anonymous victim of a rape or a sexual assault that took place on the 7th of October. This, it is like, that is such a striking thing. That is a fact. That has not ever come out. There is lots of claims about, oh, well, Hamas raped people, Hamas raped women. There's all these generalized claims that come out, but in the specifics, there is no concrete allegation of a rape or sexual assault that took place on the 7th of October. Despite these vast generalized claims, and that has completely disappeared from these mainstream Israeli narratives, like this film, We Will Dance Again. And yeah, it still gets repeated by Western politicians of, oh yeah, rape took place. So it every time I discuss this issue, it just takes me back to my book, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, because it is such a typical sort of Israeli, typical Zionist, and typical pro-Israeli propaganda technique. There are these, I hate to compare everything to the Nazis, but it is like the big lie, right? You tell the big lie, you tell it big enough, you tell it often enough, like you were saying, you repeat it often enough, and it makes a kind of impression on the ambience, even if the specifics have broken down. So it's very much like what they did to Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, where they kept the mainstream media for the entire 5 years of his leadership of the Labour Party, the main opposition party of Britain at the time. Now it's the party of government. Now it's been successfully purged of the left. They, for the whole period, they said either he was an anti-Semite or he had a problem with anti-Semitism, all these kind of ways of saying it, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. But every time you looked at the specifics, it was an anti-Zionist. It was someone who was not even necessarily anti-Zionist. They were just in sympathy with the Palestinians. It was some sort of tweet that was twisted and taken out of context or changed and just misrepresented. And there was always this kind of, but every time that was debunked, it was still like, well, there's anti-Semitism. Of course there is. How can you question that? And then even questioning it and asking for evidence became an act that was anti-Semitic in itself. So same with this. If you question, to some people, if you question the fact that, or the idea that Hamas carried out quote unquote atrocities, or war crimes on the 7th of October, then, you're an apologist for terrorism or whatever it may be. That the leadership of Hamas has said that there may have been faults that took place on the ground due to the chaotic situation and due to the Hannibal directive. Look, not everyone who was killed on the 7th of October by Palestinians was a combatant. There's no doubt about that. But the way that it's being portrayed is incredibly misleading, and not least because of the reality of the Hannibal directive.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that a lot. I appreciate all of the reporting that you all have done on that. And the point you made too, I mean, this is like one of the insidious elements of this, as you talk about in, weaponizing anti-Semitism, that point you were making of, that idea that, by questioning, like, we've been indoctrinated into a certain way of, like, if someone charges you with some form of racism, but specifically anti-Semitism, we see this come about, that to even look for evidence, or to try to say, okay, so where did that happen? What is the example of racism that you're talking about? What is the example of anti-Semitism that you're talking about? That to even try to get to specifics, it becomes this act of defensiveness or denial or whatever, that somehow then kind of recapitulates the claim of anti-Semitism itself, if that makes sense. Like that. Yeah, I mean, that the fact that, oh, so you're questioning what we're saying here, that this idea that just making the claim in itself is sort of enough. I mean, and there's a particular element of this too, around sexual violence, I think, that, which I understand, because most people do not claim or do not want to um say, hey, I was a victim of sexual violence. Like, it takes a tremendous amount of courage for people to even stand up and tell those stories. And so we've been kind of, rightfully told that we should believe people when they say this. But the interesting thing, as you point, is that there isn't somebody who is saying that. There aren't a group of people who are like, yeah, I was raped on October 7th.
Yeah, there's no
It's all
Israeli, believe Israeli women, they were saying, but there's no Israeli women to believe in the case of, alleged rape on October 7th. It's just, it's not a reality. And we know for a fact that there are Israelis who are documented to have been lying about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the whole narrative, this is something my colleague Ali has really talked about a lot. That this is actually a very deeply ingrained narrative within settler colonial societies, like the United States and Canada, where we see, really black men especially are viewed as rapists by white women within the settler colonial context of, that they are supposed to be savages from Africa and that they can't help themselves. And these are the propaganda narratives that are really weaponized against black men in the United States and other settler colonial societies, as a way to really oppress them and keep them out of power and out of the I guess the sort of you could say the legitimate sphere of society within those within these societies. And it's something that it's really a false narrative that has been really weaponized against black people in the United States for so long. And we see it's deep. It's a deep part of the settler imagination that the natives are rapists, they're killers, and so forth. And it's exactly the same thing in Palestine. That, and that's why you see these two Israelis in this film saying about their fears that they're going to be raped by Palestinians, and that they, they may even believe that very strongly, because of the environment they've been brought up in and the way they've been taught by the society that surrounds them to dehumanize Palestinians and Palestinian men, especially in this case, that they really talked themselves, and that's why you started to see, you saw straight away the claims that Palestinians would rape Israelis straight away before these supposed eyewitnesses came out. And that's why the New York Times went and tried to find these eyewitnesses, and they didn't find any. They found some liars who made up these ridiculous stories that have now been quietly disappeared. And similarly, the whole 40 beheaded babies thing, which was a complete lie, complete invention. There was lots of other lurid inventions. Max Blumenthal really was the first, and we followed it up as well. Max Blumenthal was the first to expose the issue of the Israeli organization Zaka, which is it's a Jewish extremist organization. They are portrayed in the Western media as first responders and almost paramedics, but actually they have no medical or scientific training. It's really a religious organization that it responds to things like accidents in Israel, where there are dead bodies that should be buried in a particularly Jewish way. And Max Blumenthal was really the first to expose them in the context of, he's got a really good film out just recently, last week on the 7th of October, really getting into a lot of the same issues that I get into in my piece. And he talks in there about how Zaka, this Israeli first responders organization, which was one of the main Israeli groups responsible for this lie about the executed children supposedly executed by Palestinian fighters on the 7th of October. Max Blumenthal says how they were really broke before the 7th of October, and a large part of the motivation for making up these stories was really just financial. It was that basic, really, that they fundraised very well off the back of it. It's not just Zaka. There's another one called a competitor organization called, I believe it's called United Hatzalah, and they actually make millions off the back of these atrocity stories. But the results have been deadly, as we can see in the Gaza Strip. Like even last night, the lie about Palestinian quote unquote savages burning babies alive has been told in order to justify what Israel knew it was going to do, which is to actually burn Palestinian babies alive in the Gaza Strip, as it did periodically every year or two in the Gaza Strip for many, many years. Gaza Strip has been an open concentration camp for many, many years now, where every few years Israel carries out another bombing operation, another incursion. They even had a doctrine where they referred to it as mowing the lawn, where the humans in Gaza, the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, the civilians and the fighters alike, are all seen as grass. They're mowing the lawn, mowing back the lawn. We just have to basically eradicate all the savages every few years, cut back the excess human population, or kill and kill and kill, as the influential Israeli planner Arnon Sofer put it back in the Ariel Sharon years. Kill and kill and kill. That's the price of a Jewish state in Palestine, a country which is overwhelmingly non-Jewish. That's the price of a Jewish state. That is what Zionism does. That is the reality of Zionism. The reality of Zionism is people being burned alive in their tents in Deir el-Balah. That's the reality that we're living under.
Absolutely. I mean, every day it feels like there's whether it's the Palestinian resistance or the Lebanese resistance, there's a successful military operation, that's directly responding to military targets, as you said earlier, that then is responded to by whether it's Israel saying, we're going to bomb an orphanage today or another hospital or another tent city. Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's painful. It's painful to watch, and to feel, and sometimes, unfortunately, a bit helpless about what we can do to stop it. And I know that that's not entirely the case, because everybody, does organize and is struggling in the ways that they can, but it certainly can very much feel that way, and we have to do more. So let's talk a little bit about the civilian piece. And let's talk about the Hannibal Directive more. I mean, I don't know how much more you want to say about it. You said quite a bit, but obviously we're familiar about it. We talked a little bit about what it is, but beyond what you've said, what can you say about some of the ways that it was implemented, the areas, and kind of your sourcing? Like, I thought that was interesting in the piece, the different interviews and sources that you've been able to find to kind of verify this in different areas.
Right, so the Hannibal Directive, it was something we were already covering at the Electronic Intifada. I did look back on our coverage, and I believe the first piece we wrote about it was my colleague Ali Abu Nama again, back in 2014, where there was this soldier, Haydar Goldin, who was killed in a Hannibal strike in Rafah. So we were aware of it, and so we could see just from the videos that were coming out on 7th of October, and my late lamented friend, the martyr, Rifat Al-Arir, said straight away the videos that were coming out from the Israeli military themselves, you could tell they were Hannibaling their own people, because you could see these streams of people on foot and in vehicles going back to Gaza and just being shot, just being bombed and shot by helicopter gunship strikes on their way back to Gaza. And there was one video which is still online on the official Israeli official at Israel Twitter account, which is very graphic, and it was part of their campaign at the time, a few days after, trying to say, again, there's another campaign that's been pretty much dropped, which is Hamas's ISIS. They were trying to say Hamas is doing the same as ISIS. They're burning people alive. And they showed a completely destroyed car. It's a very graphic video. If we put it in this, if you put it in this live stream, you probably have gotten age restricted. Well, you would definitely get age restricted on YouTube. And it's a completely incinerated car. And there's two charred corpses in the back, almost completely incinerated. But you can see their intestines, and you can see the skulls and the outlines of faces of two people in the back seat of the car, right? And so the sheer destruction of the car, the roof is completely wrecked. I have put still images in my piece taken from that video, so fair warning on that. It's quite disturbing, but it's very clear from the destruction. Like anyone like us who have covered the Israeli bombings over the years, the bombing campaigns that have taken place over the years, targeting Palestinians in Gaza Strip, either bombing cars, civilian cars, and fighters' cars alike. It's very clear that hasn't been done by just setting the car alight or even hitting it with a rocket-propelled grenade, which we know Palestinian fighters have. It's clear from the total destruction of the car, the entry point of the bombs through the roof, the completely twisted roof, right? It's not just scorched or, maybe the engine's a bit exploded. The whole car is destroyed. It's very, very clear that's been hit by either an Israeli drone, Apache helicopter, or possibly even a bomber jet, less likely because they're from higher altitudes, but almost certainly a helicopter gunship or a drone strike. And that's been released by the Israelis themselves. And of course, they're saying, oh, Hamas did this, Hamas is ISIS. But it's clear if you actually look at the evidence and what your eyes actually show you instead of what the Israeli lies are telling you, is very, very clear. And, Rifat was saying that from the video straight away. So we could tell it was happening straight away. And then later, this was confirmed by Israeli media reports. So there's lots and lots of confirmations of this. Some of the earliest confirmations actually were eyewitnesses, two Israeli eyewitnesses, survivors of a massacre that took place in Kibbutz Be'eri. And by massacre, I mean an Israeli massacre directed by the Brigadier General Barak Hiram, who is now actually, after a whitewash investigation by the Israeli military, has now actually been promoted to the head of the Gaza division. But what the eyewitnesses said was that we were the Palestinian fighters captured us. Yes, for the most part, they treated us well. There was a casualty. They killed one person by, when they were trying to break into the room, they were firing through the room. There was a man who was killed in that process. But for the most part, they were treated very well. He said we were treated. She said, her name, the survivor's name, civilian captive Yasmin Porat, who had been at the Supernova rave. She said the Palestinian fighters, they didn't abuse us. They treated us well. But they wanted to use us as leverage to get back to Gaza. And it sounds like what they wanted to do was get back to Gaza safely and then release them at the border. And we know that is likely what they would have wanted to do, because there was instances where that happened, where Palestinian fighters who were involved in this military assault on the border settlements. Sorry, border's not the right word, because it's not a border; it's a boundary line. Israel has never declared its borders. A boundary line or frontier with the Gaza Strip, and these militarized settlements, including Kibbutz Be'eri, the Palestinian fighters did take non-combatant captives, but most of them were released in the prisoner exchange in November last year, which took place during the temporary ceasefire. Most of the non-combatants, and so we know that happened in some cases, and so that was what they were trying to negotiate. But what happened instead was there was 15 people who were taken captive by the Palestinian fighters, and there was a kind of standoff. They actually waited and said, They talked to Yasmin Porat and some of the others, and they said, call your people, we want to go back to Gaza. And they were trying to negotiate an exit that way, have a negotiated exit. And it seems like they wanted to maybe set up an ambush for some of them and take soldiers captive. So, long story short, essentially at the end, Barak Hiram ordered the house where they were being taken captive tank shelled. And he actually admitted this later in a New York Times piece. Even in English, he said, yeah, we shelled that. I decided to end the standoff by shelling the house, even at the price of civilian hostages, in his words. What happened was most of them were killed. Most of them were actually completely incinerated, including the 12-year-old Israeli twins, Liel and Yanai Hatzroni, who the girl Liel, her image was later used in propaganda by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who claimed that she was burned alive by Hamas. I forget the exact words, by Hamas savages simply because she was Jewish. Complete lie. She was burned alive by an Israeli tank shell. This came out very early, but only in Hebrew, and people were sort of trying to translate snippets of it online and releasing it on Twitter and so forth. We were the first, my colleagues Ali Abu Nama and David Sheen, they both can speak Hebrew. David is more fluent, and they translated these interviews with this surviving eyewitness. And so, I think that there were a lot more massacres like this that took place, and there is evidence that suggests that. But because we know this massacre by the Israeli forces of Israelis under this Hannibal directive, because there was two surviving civilian eyewitnesses, we know a lot about it, and we can say for a fact that they were almost certainly all of them, certainly most, if probably not all, probably all of, or possibly all of them, were killed by this tank shelling. And the Israelis did this whitewash investigation where they said, well, maybe one of them was killed accidentally by us, but probably the rest of them were killed by the Palestinian terrorists. While while they were being tank shelled. Makes absolutely no sense why they would do that. After, if they wanted to kill them and execute them, they'd had them in their power all day. They could have done it. It makes no sense what this whitewash investigation said. And so there's a lot, and there's most of these sources come from the Hebrew language media, and it's quite striking. So another one of my main sources is a piece by, which I mentioned, I alluded to earlier, by an Israeli reporter called Ronan Bergman, and co-written by another Israeli reporter called Yoav Zaytoun. And they're both military and intelligence reporters for the Israeli newspaper Ynet, newspaper and website. It's one of the main sources in the Israeli press. And they wrote a long piece in January this year for the weekend supplement of Ynet, Yediot Ahronot, and it was quite significant because it was a detailed hour by hour breakdown of the first half of the 7th of October, of how it went down from the Israeli military perspective, and it contained that quote that I mentioned earlier about the Israeli, the high command in the Israeli HQ in Tel Aviv, in an underground bunker underneath the main headquarters of the Israeli military in downtown Tel Aviv, incidentally, very much in a civilian area. It contained that quote about the Gaza division being overwhelmed and all this critical stuff, and it revealed in that confirmed, we should say, because as I said, we knew it was happening. It confirmed in that the Hannibal directive was reactivated on the 7th of October and also extended to Israeli civilians. Now, what they said in that the word Hannibal wasn't used, but later on, Haaretz wrote an article in July that I mentioned where it did say actually the word Hannibal was used, certainly on the ground, as it were. That piece is really significant because Ronan Bergman, and what's also significant is that Ronan Bergman hasn't written about this in English. He's only written about it in Hebrew. Israelis tend to think that Hebrew is the secret language, but Arabs can also think too, and they can, people in the Palestinian resistance and the Lebanese resistance make a really sustained effort to understand their enemies. We do the same thing as well. And there is Hebrew can be translated as not a secret language, like some Israelis seem to think it is. And it is significant to me that Bergman, whose sources are, like I said, all in the Israeli, they're very pro Mossad, very pro Shin Bet, very pro Israeli military, and he hasn't written about the Hannibal directive in English, to my knowledge, at all. And certainly not in the New York Times in the last year, where he could have done, because he's quite a high profile way. I mean, it lets the Mossad basically launder its disinformation into the New York Times via people like Ronan Bergman, essentially. But in this article, it confirmed the Hannibal directive was reactivated on the 7th of October. And crucially, this is really the crucial thing in that piece to me, is it says at midday, the Hannibal directive was, I've got the exact quote here. The point is that it came down from the top. It wasn't like a few rogue operators, right? It was what he wrote in that piece was that from the high command of the Israeli military, what they call the pit, which is the headquarters deep under what Israelis called Hakia, the building in downtown Tel Aviv, which is the Israeli military's HQ. The decision was made at midday to invoke the Hannibal directive throughout the entire region, quote, even if this means the endangerment or harming of the lives of civilians in the region, including the captives themselves, end of quote. So that's not me writing that. That's not Electronic Intifada writing that. That's Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zaytoun writing that. And there was other similar articles that came out before that suggesting that this had happened. But this was really, to me, was the biggest and highest level confirmation that it was not only carried out, but it was ordered from the top, that there was a policy to do it. And that's what enabled people like Barak Hiram to carry out these massacres of Israelis. So it was conscious. It was conscious. It was deliberately done, and it was to stop the humiliation of the, as they would view it, as the Israelis military viewed it, the humiliation of the Palestinian resistance, taking captives, prisoners of war, and detainees who could be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners and released, who could then be released in prisoner exchanges. That was unacceptable to them, so they would rather the captives be killed. And surprisingly, I did a whole separate piece about this, which is linked in this piece, about the psychology of this and how this is actually accepted within Israeli society to a large degree. Not everybody. There is, the most of the relatives of the Israeli prisoners of war and detainees who are still in the Gaza Strip want them to be released safely and exchanged in a prisoner exchange. But nonetheless, there are others, even of the relatives, who are prepared to sacrifice them, in their words, to sacrifice them in order for the Israeli war effort, as they would see it, to be successful. And there's a long psychology to this within the settler colonial society of Israel, because if you think about, I've got this whole piece about it, which I mentioned is linked in this piece. If you think about the psychology of Zionism and the history of Zionism and the history of what they imagine to be the last stand of the Jewish zealots in first century. When was it? Was it first or second century? I can't remember the details now. But during the Roman Empire, when there was the supposed last stand of Masada will not fall again. I get into that whole history. Actually, most of that is mythology, but nonetheless, they have this whole long mythology, not historically accurate, but it's embedded in Israeli society, in the origins of Israeli society. And so there is a degree of willingness to die for Zionism within Israeli society. And that's why there is a large degree of acceptance of this doctrine.
Yeah, appreciate that. I was looking for that piece, but definitely, folks, I just want to say the piece that we're talking about today is also linked in the show description, and I encourage people to read the whole thing because we're talking about a lot of it, but it is a lengthy, in-depth piece that all of these issues we're discussing are really gone through in detail, and the sources are provided too. The point that you made actually is one of the things that I did want to talk about a little bit more, which is that you at Electronic Intifada, as you mentioned, some of the work from like Gray Zone, there's a few other outlets. Mondo Weiss has done some, there's very few outlets that are in the English language that are covering these things. But what's fascinating to me too, I mean, there's kind of two levels. I mean, one, you mentioned it, this idea that Hebrew is like a mythical or it's like a magical language that somehow people can't, even click Google Translate and see what these things say sometimes, not that I know that you all are doing much more than just clicking Google Translate at Electronic Intifada, but so there's that element of it, which is strange because it's like certainly newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, not only have people, in some cases, it's some of these same journalists that they have do articles, and also people obviously who are adept at both translating Hebrew and writing in English and so on. But so what's fascinating is that there is this kind of world in which there's a whole set of conversations about this that are happening in Hebrew within Israeli society, within different media organs. And it is almost entirely the Hebrew language media where the most open and honest discussions where they discuss these different things. And as you said, like it's not as though they even they're not usually discussed as though, like, we're really ashamed of these things, etcetera. It's sort of there's an acceptance of a lot of these realities, or there's an acceptance that the people who are listening to them won't necessarily be outraged by what they're hearing or seeing. Um, but on the flip side, obviously Israel also has English language media. They don't tend to go into the level of detail within their English language media, even if they might discuss some of these issues a little bit. Um, and then the Western press, whether it's in the UK where you are or in the US where I am, it's not even there is no conversation of it at all within the mainstream media. It's just like it doesn't exist. It's
They
a whole
must know
other
about it. The journalists must know about it. There's no way they don't know about it. They're actively
right.
covering it up.
Yeah. So that's what I kind of wanted to say is like it's a strange I find it to be a strange sort of set of factors because obviously I agree with you. It's very clear that there's an intentional cover up within the Western media not to discuss any of this. And yet they also have to know that there are people like yourselves and others out there, and I know that they've done hit pieces on you all and stuff like that too. Um, they know that there are others who are translating these things and who are doing this reporting. So there's a certain sector of the population that has access to this information that knows that these claims are false, etc. But I mean that is really quite a contradictory and amazing propaganda um, reality, I guess we could say, in which these conversations are happening in public. They're in a language that people obviously can translate and can then know what people are talking about. But yet there's just like an organized denial of this reality within the West. I get, so I'm interested in your thoughts on sort of why that is the case, and the impacts of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a large part of it is ideological, where the Western media is obviously very in alignment with its own governments, who are aligned with Israel, are aligned with US imperialism, and therefore aligned with Israel. I also think that a large part of it is the Israel lobby, that the Israel lobbies, the flack that it can throw up, to use the sort of the Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky propaganda model of the Western press, that one of those filters was the flack. Well, the Israel lobby is probably the most effective thrower up of flack, because they know that if they do something even slightly critical of Israel, they'll get a phone call from the Israeli ambassador, from the Israeli embassy, from one of the propaganda organizations of the pro-Israel lobby, especially in Britain, America, and Germany. I'm not as familiar as with Germany, of how it operates there. I'm more familiar with how it operates here, but that's certainly how it operates here. It's but that's not to excuse them, right? Because the price they would pay for that is relatively minimal, but it can't be discounted. We've seen people fired from Sky News, for example, just for asking very what I would consider to be very basic, not even slightly probing questions of Israeli spokespeople, just doing basic journalism. But it's a testament to how these media organizations roll ultimately, despite the intentions of some individual journalists within these organizations. Is not journalism. It's to be part of the Western capitalist propaganda system.
Yeah. I mean, it's just quite a remarkable example. I mean, I think if anyone, I don't know how people can see something like this. It's such an extreme example. And I mean, in some ways, I think it's good for those of us who those of us like yourselves who do real reporting on these issues, but also for those of us on the left who see this Western media as a propaganda apparatus for Western capitalism and imperialism. Um, but it is still quite amazing. I mean, it's just I don't know how anyone can take these outlets as legitimate media sources when, and they shouldn't, is basically the takeaway, I guess, from this. Um, so let's talk about a little bit. One of the things that you do too is you look at some assessments, trying to get, what bringing together what is known, right? Because you acknowledge that there are unknowns within this of, we can't possibly know exactly how many Israeli non-combatants were killed by Hamas or by Israel, given kind of all of these different factors. But you do look at some of the, what's available in terms of the data and the reports, um, and some of the different, as well as some of your own research around this. Um, so talk a little bit about this. I mean, obviously, we don't have a thorough independent investigation. And at this point, more than a year out, it's very unlikely that we would be able to get one that would be, unbiased and definitive at this point. So, but what are some of the conclusions that you come to in the piece around kind of the death toll and ways to think about the attribution of those deaths?
Yeah, that's a good summary that you gave there. I mean, I think one of the things that's really emblematic of the problems that we're facing here when we're trying to answer these questions are that the Israeli propaganda has been so successful, certainly on the political level in the West. Like, just one example of that has come out since my article was that, and I did tweet about, was that uh, none other than Barack Obama himself on the 7th of October tweeted, still saying now that 1,400 citizens, Israeli citizens, that's the word he used, which I think was, I gotta hand it to him, was quite clever. He's not saying civilians, but he's saying citizens, which gives the impression that it's civilians, right? Were killed by, however he put it, Hamas terrorists or whatever. That's completely untrue. Like, so what was kind of dumb of him was the fact that even Israel has rolled back that figure now. But if we and I detail that in the article, but if you take that figure 1,400 and you actually look at the names, because it is quite detailed of the official Israeli information that has been released by the Israeli military, if you look at the names, 40% of that figure were actually combatants. And the rest, the 60%, we don't know how many of them, like you said, we don't know how many of the 60% were killed by Israel, how many percent of the 60% were killed by Palestinians. We don't know. We can't, and it's looking increasingly unlikely that we'll ever know. Although I can't completely rule it out if there was some sort of leak, or when Palestine is liberated, there could be documents that come out. But we know for a fact that 40% of that 1,400 were combatants, including 200 Palestinian fighters, because last year the Israelis did actually come out after months of saying, oh, they murdered 1,400 people. They said, well, actually 200 of that 1,400 were Hamas fighters, and they were so badly burned, i.e. they'd been completely incinerated by drone strikes, helicopter strikes, or whatever it was. We didn't recognize them, who they were. We just sort of assumed that they were Israelis murdered by Hamas. But actually, it turns out, sorry, these 200 people were actually Hamas combatants. So 40% of that figure that Barack Obama is still using now in October 2024 were actually combatants. So the rest of that number of 40% were Israeli soldiers, military targeted by Hamas and the rest of the Palestinian resistance on the 7th of October, killed in combat with Palestinian fighters. Israeli police, border police, Israeli ununiformed combatants, what you could call settlement militias in the kibbutzim, because they were there, present on the ground. Yes, they were overwhelmed and outfought by the Palestinian fighters, but they were there. There was crossfire. There wasn't just Hannibal targetings. There was unintentional crossfire where Israelis killed Israelis, because there was quite a chaotic situation in a lot of places. Certainly at the Supernova the trance rave. Definitely a very chaotic situation. And there was even some cases of Shin Bet agents who were sent to fight on the ground there. Some of them even lived in the area that was being assaulted. So we know that for a fact. Again, from releases of the Israeli government, they confirmed openly some of these people were Shin Bet fighters. And Ronan Bergman's piece in Ynet that I mentioned earlier says definitively that 10 Shin Bet secret police and uniformed fighters were killed during those combatants. So taking all of that into account, we can say for definite that at least 40% of that 1,400 figure were combatants. And like we say, we don't know how many of the 60% were killed by Israel. It's something. It's a fact that it's a reality that's being covered up by Israel. It's definitely not too strong a word to say it's being covered up. I know from speaking to the makers of an Al Jazeera, the Al Jazeera investigative unit has done some really good films during this genocide. They've done one most recently about Israeli atrocities in the Gaza Strip and how they are filming themselves. It's called Gaza. A really disgusting and stunning film. But they also did one earlier this year, which I mentioned in my piece, where they get into the Hannibal doctrine and the issue and the question of how many Israelis. And they documented dozens who were definitely killed. And who were definitely killed by Israel in these kind of Israelis in Kibbutz Be'eri and elsewhere who were definitely killed by Israel. But if we look at the media reporting on this from these Israeli sources, the numbers have to be much bigger than that, and we know that because of the reporting by these military reporters with sources very, very close to high levels of the military and intelligence agencies in Israel. So it is. I know from talking to those Al Jazeera reporters, they talk to a lot of families of the dead in Israel, and many of those families who have not been told anything. You know, the family of Liel Hatzroni, for example, his 12-year-old Israeli twin, incinerated by Barak Hiram's the tank shelling that Barak Hiram ordered. You know, her body was completely incinerated. The families are not told anything of who killed them. You know, it's just then released in the media. Oh, well, of course Hamas killed them, but the families are not told anything. There's definitely a cover-up going on. And we know from the UN report, which is a very weak report in a lot of ways, that the UN report, so one of the sources one of my main sources for this piece was a report that the UN Human Rights Council released in June, which I say is a weak report in a lot of ways because they released it at the same time as they released a report on Gaza and on Israeli atrocities that they're carrying out. Israelis are carrying out in Gaza, and so they knew they were going to come. You know, Israel hates the UN. You know, they've made the Secretary General persona non grata, banned him from the country, etc., etc. So they knew that they were going to come in for more flack from Israel from doing this report. So they thought, foolishly, okay, we'll do like a balancing report about October the 7th and what they claimed were war crimes by the Palestinian fighters on October 7th. And so the report's quite weak in that way. Like it really relies on uncritically on Israeli sources in a lot of ways. It makes some basic mistakes as well. Like it calls the boundary line of the Gaza Strip with so-called Israel, they call it a border. There's just lots of basic errors in it. So it's quite weak in a lot of ways. But even that report has some really fascinating insights about the Hannibal directive. It confirms that the Hannibal directive took place in several areas, not just in Kibbutz Be'eri. They document it in several places. But that report as well says that, quote, the Commission considers that Israel is obstructing its investigations into events on and since 7th of October 2023, both in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territory, end of quote. So even the UN Human Rights Council is saying, which did its best to try and, in some ways, to really kind of try and buff the false Israeli narrative about Palestinian atrocities against Israelis. Even they are saying, well, the Israelis are obstructing us. They blocked all their access, by the way, to the country. They wouldn't let them into the country. They don't get into the details of it, but I presume they would have had to talk to the Israelis that they talk to over the internet and so forth. And the they are the Israel is obstructing an independent international investigation into true events of 7th of October. But we know from a lot of the reporting that it was extensive. So, for example, that 7 days investigation, 7 days is the weekend supplement of Yediot Ahronot that I mentioned. It's Key Source by Ronan Bergman and Yoav Zaytoun, this long read, which has only been published in Hebrew, but we published a full translation in January. In that piece, in that investigation, the one that confirmed that Hannibal doctrine was enacted through the entire region from midday on the 7th of October. In that piece, it concludes that Israeli military investigations, quote, examined some 70 vehicles that did not reach Gaza because on their way they had been hit by fire from a helicopter gunship, a UAE, that's a drone, or a tank, and at least in some of those cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed. So if everyone in the vehicle was killed in those vehicles, and remember, vehicles includes Toyota Hilux pickup trucks that we know the Palestinian, the elite forces, elite commando forces of Hamas had these, and they stuffed captives into the back of them, many captives. As well as cars, and there was cases of tractors with trailers full of captives being stuffed full. In some of those cases, everyone was filled. So times 70 vehicles by who knows how many captives, Israeli captives in those vehicles being killed. It could easily be many hundreds. There's many other confirmations of this, and from Israeli press, often usually Hebrew language press. And there's another key quote as well from the Haaretz article, which was released in English in July, where they say that, quote, the way that they say that the Hannibal doctrine was ordered by the Gaza division they time it to exactly 11:22 a.m. On the 7th of October, quote, not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. That's such a key quote, because they were annihilating every vehicle that was on the road back to Gaza, regardless of whether it had captives in it or not. So, we can't know for sure, but it seems very much, and it seems very, very likely that hundreds of that 60% of the casualties, hundreds of those Israelis, it does seem that they were killed by Israel.
Absolutely. And I think, first of all, beyond all of what you have laid out, which I think is quite important for people to understand. In terms of, 70 vehicles packed with people, the Institute of at Kibbutz Be'eri, obviously, as you say, the supernova rave being such a chaotic situation, and all of this, and the Hannibal directive being deployed. If of that 1,400, they were like, oh, actually 200 of these people are Palestinian later on, and we couldn't realize because they're so incinerated. Like, it just, even that comment like begs the question of how many people did you incinerate that, were Israeli, if,
Exactly.
because, it's, yeah, it's quite telling, I think, all of it. And
That's
yeah,
how
I just,
indiscriminate the fire was. And
right.
in that Al Jazeera film about the Hannibal directive from earlier this year, they have a whole compilation of clips. There were so many clips that the Israeli military released of either helicopter turret gunfire, or it's usually this green footage that you see, not always green, but quite often this heat sensitive footage, and it's very blurry, and you can't all you can see is firing firing at these targets. There's one, and you can't really tell who's who, and there's one clip in that film which is very disturbing of a car being driven across a ploughed field, which looks very similar to the ploughed field that the ravers were escaping away from the rave site, the supernova rave site. It looks very similar to that field, if not the same field. And there's a car packed full of people, overstuffed full of people. We don't know who they are. They're all being shot at, and they're all trying to escape from this helicopter gunship attack. And we don't know the fates of those people. And there's a lot of video like that, and most of this video tends to get age restricted on YouTube, but you can find it still out there. There's so many unanswered questions about what happened on the 7th of October, and really a kind of almost epilogue to my piece is at the end, where I get into one of the things as well that was spread a lot on social media was of all these cars that were destroyed, and you can see, there was a period actually. I think it was earlier this year, but possibly it might have been in November. I can't remember when, but when people were sharing the photos of this drone footage of all these destroyed cars from the aftermath of these attacks, and like I said, a lot of these cars, some of the cars, okay, you can tell they've been shot at by small arms, right? There's bullet holes, maybe an occasional exploded engine, right? But which could have been hit by an RPG. Cars can be set on fire, but many of these cars have been completely crushed, obliterated. They're completely twisted, and exploded, and similar to buildings in the kibbutzes, have been completely flattened. There's no way RPGs could have done these kind of things. And they've collected a lot of these cars in a so-called car cemetery in southern so-called Israel, and the photos of these cars collected together, posted on social media, was sort of soft banned for a while on Twitter, by Elon, by Elon Musk's X, so-called X, because it would put a community note underneath and say it was just very vague. It didn't matter what you said, even if you just posted the photo, it would just say, "Oh, this has been debunked," and they would just put all these links to all these mainstream media articles, kind of denying that these were bombed by Israel. But it's very clear that a lot of these cars were bombed by Israel, and you can look at the footage of this. It's now become a sort of tourist attraction. They call it it's near one of the settlements it's near is Tecuma, and you can look it up. And I embedded one of the videos on YouTube. It's very, very clear that a lot of these cars were not bombed by the Palestinian resistance. They don't have that kind of weaponry, that kind of artillery or drones. They do have some drones, but you can see, and I included a video of the drones that the Palestinian resistance has. They are small drones akin to drones that you can buy in shops in the West, which are kind of jury rigged with a little camera, and then there's a hand grenade on it, and they drop the hand grenade to attack Israeli soldiers, and there's footage of them doing that. But they don't have, Hellfire missiles. They don't have Apache attack helicopters, and they don't have Elbit Hermes 450 drones that can annihilate whole buildings and completely destroy cars in the way that you can see that many of these vehicles were. It's all there in plain sight. A lot of this stuff is there in plain sight. You just have to kind of look past the propaganda to see it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think too, it's like beyond, I mean, I appreciate all of the work that you all do, because you're detailed and rigorous and hold yourself to standards of journalistic integrity around this stuff to actually be able to, positively kind of demonstrate and prove some of these points. But even from a standpoint of logic, I mean, why would the Palestinian resistance want to bomb a bunch of cars that also had their own militants in them? Like, that doesn't even make any sense at all, whereas, as we know, there is a logic that Israel is operating under here of, we don't want hostages to get back to Gaza. So, Absolutely. Again, appreciate so much of this conversation and the work that you've done here, and all of your colleagues again at Electronic Intifada. Um, I know that we got to wrap up soon. Is there anything else that you wanted to kind of close with or share before we let you go?
I guess. I mean, I hope that we will find out. I hope that the truth about the 7th of October will be revealed. But I mean, I think it's important to say that, and I guess one of the main reasons that keeps us reporting on this topic is that they knew what they were doing in setting up this propaganda, that they would be, because of the humiliation that the Palestinian resistance inflicted on the Gaza division and how they completely defeated the Gaza division, they needed to strike back from their perspective, from the perspective of the Israeli enemy. They needed to strike back, and what that meant for them was striking back against the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, killing men, women, and children in the Gaza Strip, and teaching them a lesson as they saw it. That in order to survive as a settler colonial state, they have to carry out a genocide. That is the price of Zionism. That is what they were setting up with all this atrocity propaganda, and that is what they were trying to prevent by they were trying to prevent the situation in which they would have hundreds and hundreds of live Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip that could be bargained for in a prisoner exchange. And like I said at the top, there's probably only a few dozens of Israeli prisoners of war and detainees left alive in the Gaza Strip today, because since the 7th of October, Israel has been, as we all know, carrying out a genocide and bombing every area of the Gaza Strip. And one of the things I do get into in the piece is that some of the detainees who were released in the prisoner exchange during the brief pause in November last year, it seems a million years ago now, when there was that few days temporary ceasefire pause. Some of those Israelis who were released actually, are incredibly critical of the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and are saying, they said, again, this is a piece that was only published by Ynet in Hebrew. They had a kind of town hall meeting with Netanyahu, and they said, we were bombed. And they said in other media, in The Guardian, that we were bombed. We were afraid, not from Hamas, our captors, who sounds like they were treated humanely. We weren't afraid from Hamas. We were afraid from being bombed by Israel. And of course, there was a very high-profile case of the 3 Israelis, escaped Israeli captives. It seems they were prisoners of war. They seemed to be men of military age. I don't know whether they were definitely soldiers or not, but it seems highly likely. But in any case, they escaped from their captors, however, where they did, and they tried to get back to Israeli army lines, and they were shot dead by the Israelis. They were shot dead. Many of these, certainly 35 of the Israeli captors in the Gaza Strip have been officially declared dead by Israel. The true number is probably higher. So we know from the numbers of people who've been released and the number who've captured, we know there's about 100 captives left in the Gaza Strip. But how many of them are still alive? Probably half of them, quite possibly half of them are dead. It depends. It depends how many are alive left for a prisoner exchange now. And it seems Israel is very much aiming for them to be 0, so they can carry out what they're carrying out, the genocide and the expulsion of the Palestinian people from Gaza Strip, unimpeded. And that the last barriers to doing that will be completely obliterated. Not that there seems to be any barriers for them. There seems to be no red lines for them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's wild to see that the lack of any kind of red lines for Israel, but also for the United States. I mean, just continuing to send them shipment after shipment of bombs that
Yeah.
would never be used in I mean, even in other wars, the types, you know, you don't drop bunker busters on, you know, tent cities and things like this. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's very painful.
It is.
Um, Asa, thank you so much. Again, really appreciate your time. I hope we can do it again. Maybe we can have you on to talk about weaponizing anti-Semitism at some point. It'd be
Yep.
interesting to go through that book with you.
I'd love to.
Um, and again, shout out to you and all your colleagues at Electronic Intifada. And yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. This has been great.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks for having me, and we appreciate all the work you do too. I know several of my colleagues are, probably all of them, but I certainly know several of my colleagues are listeners to the show. So we appreciate all the work you do, and thank you for having me again.
Thank you.